All right, now that you've practiced prayer, just draw a line underneath that. And the next thing we want to do is go from prayer to your story. Now, your story is really important because it's a way for you to tell about what God has done in your life that might whet their appetite to hear how God can be at work in their life as well. And so in order to tell your story in a minute or less, we want to break it into 3 parts. The first part of the story, we want to look back. The middle part of the story, we want to talk about how we put our relationship in Jesus. And the last part of the story, we want to talk about what our life has been like since we put our faith in Jesus. And so after I've prayed with someone, a very natural transition would be to say something like this. You know, there was a time in my life when, and then you talk about your story before Jesus. And so just write that phrase down. There was a time in my life when. Right? And then you want to tell them what your life was like before you came to Jesus. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think of a word, a couple of words, or a couple of phrases that would describe your life before you put your faith in Jesus. And as you think of those words or phrases, just write them down right there under that statement. There was a time in my life when, and then the next 2 statements. So pause your video and then think of a couple of statements that would work or a couple of words, and then we'll go on to the next part. Okay, so now that you've done that, you've got a couple of words. So for instance, my story would go something like this. There was a time in my life when I was very religious and I was trying to do all the right things because I felt like that would get me in God's good graces. Not only was I religious, but I was also really judgmental, especially judgmental against people who hadn't put their faith in Jesus. That's the first part of my story. But my story changes when I met Jesus, and the phrase we want to use to transition to that part of the story is this phrase, but then. And that's when I talk about how I put my faith in Jesus. And I want to make this very short, and I want to make this very concise. I want to take out all the religious terminology and words that I possibly can, and I want to clearly communicate what happened when I put my faith in Jesus. Now, this will be different for everybody because every story is unique. But one of the things that I try to do is talk about where I was and what I did to put my faith in Jesus. So for instance, there was a time in my life when I was really religious and judgmental, but then one night someone shared with me that I could never do enough to earn God's favor, but that I didn't have to. That Jesus came into this world and died in my place to pay for my sins, and He gave me His righteousness. And when I put my faith in Him and began to follow Him as my King, everything changed for me. All right, so I want you to pause the video again, and I want you to put into maybe 2 to 4 sentences, very concisely, what happened when you put your faith in Jesus. There was a time in my life when, but then what happened? In 3 or 4 really short sentences, really concise sentences, tell what happened when you put your faith in Jesus. So pause the video and take some time to write that out, and then we'll take the final step in telling your story. All right. Now, there was a time in my life when I was really religious, really judgmental, but then I came to know Jesus as my personal Savior. I found His forgiveness, and I entered a new relationship with Him and began to follow Him as my King. And then the last transitional phrase comes with our after story, and it's the words, and now. And now, and then think of a couple of words or phrases that would describe your life now that you've put your faith in Jesus. And so my words or phrases would be, instead of religion, I found a relationship with God. And instead of being really judgmental, God has given me a growing compassion for people who need a relationship with Him. Right? So that's your story in 3 parts. There was a time in my life when, but then, and now. So take a moment, pause the video, and write a couple of words or phrases that describe your life since you've come to know Jesus. And then we're going to practice telling our story all together. Right? So pause the video and write those phrases down. Okay, now that you've done that, you want to practice telling your story as one unified whole. And you have the framework to do it. And the easy thing is, it's your story. So it's very easy to tell. It's not about being word perfect. It's about telling the story from your vantage point. There was a time in my life when I was really religious and I was really judgmental. But then one night someone shared with me that I could never do enough to be in God's good graces, but I didn't have to. That Jesus came and He died to forgive me of my sins, to give me His right standing with God. And when I put my faith in that and began to follow Jesus as my King, everything changed. And now, instead of religious, I have a relationship with God where I can interact with Him every day. And He's given me a compassion for people who are far from Him. And then after you tell your story, you want to ask this question: do you have a story like this? Do you have a story like this? And that's a great question to ask someone, and you can find out what their relationship with God is like. Maybe they say, yes, I do. I say, well, great, tell me about that. And I may find out that they've had some sort of religious experience, but they've never really had a moment in their life where they turned to Jesus for forgiveness and began to follow Him. And so I want to circle back to that after they tell their story. Maybe they tell their story and they have a very clear story about how they put their faith in Jesus. And that's awesome, and we can celebrate with that with them. And then we can begin to ask them, hey, has anybody ever shown you how to make disciples for Jesus? And if they say no, then you can begin to teach them this 411 tool as well. But let's say that you ask the person, do you have a story like this? And they say, no, I don't. What do you do next? We're going to answer that question in just a moment. But right now, I want you to stop. I want you to practice telling your story several times. If you're training with a partner, practice telling your story to each other and sharpening it up, critiquing it. Practice how to tell your story, how to train somebody how to tell their story, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is God's story.